Hello and welcome to Mekelle Foresight, and this is Mekelle, producer and host of the show. The international community has been monitoring the situation in Ethiopia, which, to say the least, is precarious. With us today on Mekelle Foresight is William Davison, who is the senior analyst for Ethiopia at the International Crisis Group. William Davison, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
You're a senior analyst for Ethiopia, and you happen to be here in one corner of this country. What have you been doing this week?
Primarily speaking to the regional government in Tigray about the situation with the federal government, the tensions, and what seemed to be the deteriorating political relations.
Did you find it fruitful?
Yes, absolutely. Certainly got a very clear picture of the situation, the thinking from the regional leadership. So yes, fully informed about the circumstances and the attitude here from the leadership.
Okay, the International Crisis Group, ICG, released a report in August under the title, Toward an End to Ethiopia's Federal Tigray Feud. There were, among others, two main proposals in that report that ICG thought would avert a confrontation between Ethiopia's federal government at the time and its rival in Tigray. One is that Tigrayan officials should press pause on election preparations, and both sides should embrace dialogue to address the dispute and underlying causes. What has changed since in terms of avoiding a possible confrontation?
Well, the election occurred on September the 9th. And I think at Crisis Group we're fully aware of some of the criticism of that recommendation, but given the circumstances that the country now finds itself in, I think that explains why Crisis Group made that recommendation. It wasn't an attempt to undermine Tigrayan sovereignty or Tigrayan democracy, and the election was obviously very well attended, relatively successful and peaceful. But the problem was that it was in defiance of the federal authorities. So the reason the recommendation was made to pause the election if there was dialogue on the table is because of the concerns at Crisis Group that we would end up in the type of situation we are now in. And primarily what I mean by that is that very predictably the federal government, via the House of Federation, classified the election as essentially unlawful, therefore the new elected Tigray government as unlawful. Of course, we then came to the end of the federal government's original constitutional end of its mandate, and so Tigray has classified the federal government as unlawful. So we've ended up in a very, very difficult political situation. And I think the important thing to add to that is that on top of this mutual lack of recognition of each other's legality, there is also the threat or the proposal from the federal government to cut the federal subsidy to Tigray. And that would mark another very serious escalation of this crisis, and that's due in a couple of weeks' time, potentially.
You said you are aware of the criticism regarding that report. One of these criticisms is that this report was encumbered by the need to strike a balance, and that this might have veered you off the reality on the ground.
Well, I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that. Yes, absolutely. There's an effort to strike a balance in the sense of trying to find a compromise position. So therefore, speaking to the both sides' concerns in any given dispute. So that's certainly what we tried to do with that report. Ultimately, well, not ultimately, but I think the key recent element of this very serious political dispute is a divergence on constitutional interpretation. Crisis Group's job is not to come down on one side or the other in terms of Ethiopians disagreeing, Ethiopian political factions disagreeing about their interpretation of the constitution. So yes, there was an effort to speak to both sides, but as you imply, obviously there is a reality on the ground and there is an evolving reality. These recommendations were made prior to the election in the hope that we did not reach this even more critical stage we're at now. We are at that critical stage now, so there needs to be a a reassessment and new recommendations based on the reality as it exists now.
To paraphrase it a little bit, the critics say that this need for balance might have put you off track, made you not see the reality on the ground.
Which reality are you referring to?
This universally accepted reality that there is a need for, undertaking elections. You cannot impose yourself on the people without, accountability, without the vote of the people. That the federal government was trying to impose its will on the people of Tigray, who, according to the constitution, opted to go to the elections.
Well, Tigray is a member of the Ethiopian Federation. As I've already noted, this is a constitutional debate. It's a constitutional disagreement. The way that the federal government decided to deal with the election delay that was necessitated by the pandemic was the process of constitutional interpretation, the ruling by the Council of Constitutional Inquiry, and the subsequent decision by both chambers of Parliament. That was technically according to the constitutional procedure. That's the federal government's position.
Constitution provides for, interpretation when there's a dispute. There was no dispute in courts.
I don't think there's any need to get into the technicalities of this. Obviously, there are different interpretations of when you can have a process of interpretation. It's not entirely clear what the process, according to the Constitution, was for dealing constitutionally with the situation, given the fact that given the eventuality that an election delay was necessitated. So, for example, if every political party in the country agrees that COVID-19 meant that an election delay was necessary, what did the Constitution prescribe for how that situation would be dealt with? What is the constitutionally prescribed mechanism of dealing with that situation?
When there are ambiguities, when there are...
So that ambiguity could be classed as a need for constitutional interpretation.
According to the Ethiopian Constitution, it is left to the regions when there are such ambiguities in the Constitution.
Well, I think that sounds like another aspect of the debate, which was, did the House of Federation and the federal government essentially, did it have the authority to extend regional government's terms? And that was, as I understood it, was quite an underexplored aspect of the debate. And I think these are absolutely all valid points for debate. We fully understand the different interpretations here, but it is also the case that the House of Federation does have the legal authority to interpret the Constitution. So if you accept that this was a case where constitutional interpretation was needed, you can see, at least, I think you could see the validity of the theoretical validity of the arguments from the federal government. That's not to say that that is the only valid interpretation. As just discussed, the idea that the federal government cannot extend the regional government's terms in this quite unilateral manner without any kind of formal consultation with the regional governments is also a valid point. The issue here is that there was a serious disagreement over these aspects of the Constitution, and that has fed into the existing political problems and taken us to this very dangerous political moment.
The report also saw the regional elections in Tigray that was held recently in terms of whether it would change balance of power in the state or not, rather than in terms of the right of the people to elect their leaders according to the letter and spirit of the Constitution, and as one form of democratic exercise.
I'm not too sure what you're getting at there. I think maybe the issue with the report that seems relevant is that it was very focused on how to prevent this political dispute escalating into armed conflict. So it wasn't focused on elaborating and articulating the rights to self-determination as granted under the Constitution or other aspects. We could see the election from another perspective as an integral part of Ethiopia's democratic development and the development of a more democratic and pluralistic federation. That could be a perspective to view this democratic exercise on. As it was with this report, like I say, we were really focused on the clear difference of opinion between the federal and regional governments and worried that that might lead to armed conflict. and therefore focusing on that and suggesting ways to avoid that trajectory.
Before I move to other issues, just one last thing on the report. This view of the ICG equating elections to mere tool in the balance of power, its proposal for Tigray authorities to put the election on hold, and then if they go ahead with it, proposing a fallback option to the federal government to accept it as long as the region goes for re-election later on when the rest of the country conducts elections. Many find this in the report not only unprincipled but as advancing paternalism and double standards. Why should the Tigray people go for a re-election while they have already done that and elected their leaders?
Well, I think if there's a desire to bring Tigray and its government and ultimately its people back into full membership, full harmonious membership of the federation, then we can see a logic at least in aligning electoral cycles there. And also, I think because there's such a stark dispute, as we've discussed, we're looking for both sides to make concessions and accommodation. So the accommodation would be that the federal government did not react in the way that it has done to Tigray regional elections. That would have been an act of de-escalation. And then in response, as a reciprocal measure, Tigray agreed to run the election again next year at the time of the other elections for the regional state councils in Ethiopia. That was the logic of that recommendation, and obviously it's very clear what the other side is, that as the election is considered legitimate in Tigray, why should we hold it again under a year later or whatever it may be? That's also, it's possible to see the validity of that argument. We could then go on and say, well, what's the harm in having another democratic exercise? It would give these relatively new Tigrayan opposition parties a little bit more time to find their feet, and it would arguably further advance Tigrayan democracy. So there's various arguments that we can make, but I certainly acknowledge the one that you are making.
The election was held in which 2.7 million people took part. How can you just ignore this and hold another election just for the sake of, doing an election?
The idea is to try and reduce the chances of conflict. Like if you prioritize reducing conflict, then the other considerations, whilst very important, the high turnout, the fact that it was an important democratic exercise are all important. But if the eventuality there is leading to conflict, then you can see the kind of then you can see the logic in the type of reciprocal accommodative measures we're suggesting. I think it's important not to see these things in zero-sum terms. Like if a certain approach is suggested in the interests of avoiding violent conflict, which would be absolutely devastating for Tigray and the country and the region possibly, then don't think that the recommendation is designed to undermine or disrespect. It's being done in the interest of de-escalation, and then you have some, we could see it as sort of collateral damage in terms of the negative effects. So it's neither wholly positive or wholly negative, but the intention would be to avoid that conflict, that potential conflict that I keep referencing.
It's interesting to note that the federal authorities picked that recommendation and said that Tigray should hold another election together with the rest of the country.
Well, are you suggesting that they were led by the crisis group report? That could be a question of correlation, not causation, right? They may have come to the same conclusion independently. Ultimately, we would hope that the federal government is also looking for peaceful ways out of this solution. Because I think the most important thing here, and at Crisis Group we think the most important thing here is maintaining peace.
ICG has also called on Dr. Abiy to embrace dialogue. How can this happen when most of the opposition leaders are behind bars?
The recent arrest of a number of opposition political leaders, the Oromo nationalist bloc, also from polar opposite parts of the Ethiopian political spectrum, are a major obstacle to an inclusive national dialogue. So if a national dialogue was established and then some of these popular influential leaders were not part of it, it would reduce the chances of a successful outcome. But perhaps more seriously than that, as we've seen from the TPLF and the Tigray's government, some of the key participants in the national dialogue, they want to see the release of these jailed leaders as essentially as a precondition to establishing the dialogue. So, therefore, we can't even get the dialogue started unless they are released. So they're both an impediment to successful outcome, but potentially an impediment to even getting the dialogue off the ground. So a very major issue.
And now regarding the administration of justice. Justice is not being served. Many of the opposition political party leaders who have been released or bailed out by court have been put back in prison by the executive. Isn't this concerning to the international community?
Well, I can't speak fully on behalf of the international community, but typically any kind of due process concerns, any sort of breach of due process would be frowned upon. There's obviously a major concern about these arrests of opposition leaders. At the very least, it's likely that they are going to be perceived as political by huge swathes of the opposition support, and that creates a problem for the credibility of any forthcoming electoral process, for example. So yes, fully aware of those due process concerns. There are also reason to think, partly from the government's own positions, that there is plenty of work to do in terms of creating a fully reformed justice system with a judiciary that's fully independent from the executive. There's many reasons for the concern there. Ultimately, though, the trials are ongoing, so we have to see the quality of the evidence and we have to see the verdicts that emerge at the end of the trials.
Those in the opposition and also the federalist forces, including the regional government of Tigray, have been calling for a holistic understanding of the call for national dialogue. And they cite security concerns like the presence of external forces, including Eritrean security forces. They say that it is unthinkable to go to Addis and sit for dialogue while the Eritrean government has its security forces all over the country, including in Addis Ababa, the capital.
Yeah, I'm not too aware of I think that's sort of quite a long way down the road, in a sense. I'm not downplaying the security concerns that some of the participants have, but at the moment, the major concerns or the major challenges are just simply getting the parties around the table. We have mentioned this arrested political leaders issue. So, according to the TPLF leadership, unless there is essentially some form of amnesty, then they're not going to participate. And then, of course, there is also the very important demand for some form of interim or caretaker government to oversee elections. So in order to get this dialogue off the ground, leaving aside these security concerns for now, we need the federal government to decide to reverse these prosecutions, essentially, and engage in some sort of comprehensive political amnesty. And then the federal government also needs to sort of, in some way, sort of sign up to formally stepping down from power and allowing some form of caretaker government to form in order for this dialogue to take shape. These are the major challenges and concerns at the moment, I think.
The authorities in Addis Ababa have now decided to hold elections while taking precautionary measures against COVID-19 just merely a week after Tigray held its own elections. Do you see any sound reasoning in this?
I guess I'm not really privy to the thinking of the federal authorities in detail and that of the health authorities. I think there is. I've recently heard the Prime Minister refer to the relative lack of harm that the virus itself is causing in Africa. So that seems to be the government's belief. That's obviously an understanding that's evolved over time. There's also been various demonstrations of electoral processes in a number of places during the pandemic, including Tigray, of course. So I guess all this events, new information, and also political developments fed into the government's thinking, and they've ended up at this decision. Exactly, why that decision was made and for what reasons, I'm sorry, I'm not privy to that information.
The pandemic is increasing and not decreasing since March when it first broke out in Ethiopia.
Well, I think, you're always likely to have an increase in this type of circumstance, right? It would be more about, is it as bad as expected? The point I was making was that the federal government seems clear that the harm being caused by COVID-19 is not as bad as was once feared, and I'm just saying that may have fed into their thinking. I can't be sure about that, though.
Given the violence unleashed in various parts of the country, and particularly against the Oromo people, and its repression against its leaders who have been thrown behind bars for just challenging the constitutionality of Abiy's actions in postponing the elections, his critics cite this as testimony to discredit Abiy's attempt to depict the political and constitutional crisis in the country as a feud between his group and Tigray as being off track. The ICG seems to back this view as it stated in its report, and I quote, "The recent outbreak of violence in Oromia sounded a serious warning regarding Ethiopia's political transition." What do you say to that?
There seems to be a couple of different things there, as I understand the question. There is obviously a major political dispute between the federal government and Tigray's government.
There's more to it than that.
Equally, obviously, there are major political problems elsewhere in Ethiopia as well. And of course, the most serious political violence, as you referenced recently in Ethiopia, not the only one. We've also had violence in Wolaita, protests being met by security forces killing protesters. There's been recent reports of violence in Somali region. There's been the outbreak more of intercommunal violence in Mekelle zone of Benishangul Gumuz. But in early July, and then also in mid-August as well, the violence was in Oromia. And that's obviously another major challenge for Ethiopia. So, as I understand the situation, there is a very serious political disagreement between the federal government and Tigray's government. I think there's an argument to be made that is the most serious and potentially consequential of the specific disputes, but it is far from the only political challenge and violent political episode that the country has experienced or is facing.
When Dr. Abiy came to power, many had hoped for more political space, for more democratization, but now there is increasing criticism of Abiy's unilateral tendencies. Do you concur to that?
I think there's certainly legitimate concerns in that regard, and I think it's good that one of the best examples is this the process of election delay and constitutional interpretation, and then ultimately the extension of the government's terms. You've been highly critical of Crisis Group, as I understand it, during this interview. But if you'll remember, back in the summer when COVID first emerged and the potential for an election delay emerged, Crisis Group quite early on argued that given Ethiopia's political transition and essentially the dynamics of that transition and what fueled that transition, the political concerns that were expressed across Ethiopia, it was appropriate that there was going to be some sort of inclusive management of this election delay to take us through for elections. Exactly what form that would take would be something that would emerge from discussions between the Ethiopian political forces. As you know, there were a number of ideas that were being chucked around. But then as things materialized after this process of constitutional interpretation, of course it was a very unilateral decision, simply to extend all government's terms with no formal role for the opposition. And that really has contributed significantly to the political challenges that Ethiopia now faces. So this is just one example of where that promise of enhanced democracy and essentially sort of political pluralism has certainly not been met yet. But we know also there's a government, there's an important government narrative here, that space was created and that the opposition has acted in an irresponsible manner. And that has what has led to the government federal government coming back in and closing down political space and perhaps an increased use of coercive measures by security forces. That's also part of the picture here. But ultimately, there is no doubt that there have been unilateral actions taken that, given the promises that were made by the government and given the hope at the outset of this transition, we might well have reasonably expected the government not to take that sort of unilateral approach.
I'm aware of the government's position, but the opposition, the public, had given a huge reserve of goodwill to the government, this government. And it's only after it crossed the line, the constitutional manipulation to extend its power, that they started, openly opposing.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, we certainly saw very enthusiastic participation pre-COVID in the sort of early days of the electoral process. I think it's fair to say that it was only once the pandemic arrived and then it had these political repercussions that we saw the opposition really questioning in a fundamental way the commitment of the government to the democratic process. I feel like up until the emergence of the pandemic, then the opposition, despite its concerns, issues with the electoral board, registration, claims of arrests and office closures, rallies being cancelled, licenses being denied for meetings, that was all there, but the opposition was looking to participate in the democratic process. So I certainly understand the point you're making there.
An anonymous veteran regional observer you quoted in the August report characterized the Prosperity Party and the TPLF as playing Russian roulette, and that it is a small step from there to a conflict that will worsen the chronic crisis the country faces if parties across the board do not step back. What needs to happen to avoid a conflagration of conflict?
Well, what's evident now, and I think those comments are looking fairly prescient, or at least they're as valid now, if not more so, than at the time the report was made. They were probably obtained in July or something. The report was published in August, if I recall correctly. Worryingly, they're still valid. The next crunch point here is whether the federal government moves ahead with cutting the federal budget subsidy to Tigray as a result of what the government has classed as an unlawful election and thus an unlawful government. This would mark a major escalation in this political disagreement. Obviously, Tigray has promised to tit-for-tat fiscal measures in terms of withholding federal taxes. Inevitably, that will see, in turn, that will see a response from the federal government. So what we're looking at there is a chain reaction and a negative escalator of this crisis. So whatever can be done to establish some process of dialogue, or at least agree not for that step to occur, to buy more time for the establishment of negotiations, is necessary at this stage. It's desirable, because that does mark potentially such a serious escalation of the crisis if the budget is cut. Because as you know, the Tigray's government considers that the fiscal arrangement, the allocation of the federal subsidy, to be integral to the federal contract. So they feel that the federal government is effectively pushing Tigray out of the federation if that measure occurs. This would be a very, very serious and grave political development, and therefore, it must be avoided in the interests of establishing some form of dialogue. As we've discussed, the problem then is getting the parties to dialogue. And that's partly because of the positioning of the federal government and other parties, but also because of the positioning of Tigray's government. I'm not discrediting that positioning. I'm just saying that these demands for a comprehensive political amnesty for the opposition leadership, and the demands for a key goal of any negotiations to be the creation of an interim government, there is no reason to think at this stage that the federal government would accept those conditions, and they are essentially preconditions for negotiation. So we really are in a very worrying situation because of the possibility of this fiscal measure being taken, and then the difficulties of getting the parties around the negotiating table. So obviously this means that everyone has to kind of rethink, look at areas where they are willing to make concessions not concessions that they want to make, maybe going against their principles, maybe going back on positions that they've already taken. Therefore, there will be some element of loss of face. But the purpose in taking those difficult, awkward measures would be to avoid this escalating into a very serious armed conflict.
My last question, hopefully. And if these escalations that you talked about deteriorates to an open, wider conflict in Ethiopia, what regional dimension will it have for the Horn of Africa? Will it have a spillover effect to the region?
Clearly, that potential is there. And these are terrible scenarios, which it's painful to discuss. It's painful to entertain the idea that they are realistic scenarios with a kind of some sort of degree of probability which is very, very worrying. But the issue is, we've talked extensively now about the problems, how serious the federal regional dispute is here and the difficulties of finding some peaceful settlements. Therefore, we have to consider that this could lead to armed conflict. And we should note that part of the action of the federal government is to provide legal cover for military intervention here. This is part of the decisions that have been made by the House of Federation. So that is a real possibility. My point is that we can see how this could lead to some form of armed conflict between the federal and regional government. That obviously has the potential, we don't know what's going to happen then. That conflict could spread within Ethiopia. That could seriously threaten Ethiopia's the stability and integrity of Ethiopia's state. If we enter into that type of civil war scenario, clearly there would be all sorts of impact on the peripheries of Ethiopia. There would probably be significant outward migration from Ethiopia, which predominantly has been a host for the region's refugees in years. So we can absolutely see the potential impact on regional stability there. Quite aside from the fact that Ethiopia is generally perceived as an anchor of stability and order in the Horn of Africa. Well, if there's disorder in Ethiopia, you can understand the very negative repercussions on the region.
William Davison, thank you very much for this very interesting and elaborate conversation.
Thank you very much.
Distracted from the uninteresting times of peace, tranquility, and development.
The interesting ones and hard times have arrived. Of detraction and relapse, but also of mobilization and readiness, of sacrifices and victories, of hopes and great strides.
With ripple effects going far and wide.
Get the perspective.
From where events are fast unfolding. From where history is being made. From where it has always been made.
Understand the values upon which mutual benefits and success depends. Have the foresight. Get it from those who walk the talk.
From Mekelle Foresight, only on Tigray television.